going to go ahead and get started. My name is David Flam. Many of you know me. I'm from graduate of class 1401-02. That's right. I get the luxury and opportunity and privilege to moderate and have a discussion with and introduce our anchor for this year's Alumni Apex Conference. I'm not sure what made Heather think that I could handle an anchor, but something about me must have made her think I was the guy for the job.
Yeah, don't screw this up.
So, we're going to make sure this is a lively conversation, and I hope that you guys participate in this conversation. There's going to be a lot of takeaways, and I'm sure some very interesting and exciting concepts that are brought up in this conversation. But with me, sitting on stage, is Brock Long, our 10th FEMA administrator, the youngest FEMA administrator, who was confirmed in 2017, had the privilege of working on several disasters in FEMA. It's an interesting position to say privilege when your job is managing disasters. Disasters such as Hurricane Harvey and Maria. He also brought the lifelines concept to FEMA, which many of you are familiar with. Prior to that, Brock served as the FEMA Emergency Management Director for Alabama, state of Alabama, worked in Georgia as an emergency manager, and is the executive chairman for Hagerty Consulting, and has got a much longer bio than I'll sit here and read to you today. But it's very impressive nonetheless. So we're going to jump right in. I'm going to hit Brock with the hard questions, and he's got a lot of really interesting ideas, and I think you guys are going to get a kick out of this. So this morning, Brock, you and I had an opportunity to chit-chat a little bit. And the first thing that came to my mind is, it seems like these days, FEMA is the professional black eye agency. They just keep getting black eyes. And, when I'm looking at events like North Carolina, and I'm seeing the reports coming out of, FEMA folks on the ground not letting us do this or getting in the way of that or all of these things. I asked you about that, and you said, you brought up a concept called the chair concept. Yeah. And I would love it if you described the chair concept again to me in the audience.
Well, before we get started, I'm going to put out a little bit of a disclaimer. My father always told me never miss a good opportunity to keep my mouth shut. And I have failed miserably at doing that, particularly now that I'm out of office, because I tend to speak truth to power in the way that I see it, and so the things that we're going to be talking about, I'm very passionate about. If you don't understand the definition of passion, it's the right mix of love and anger. I love what I have done and been a part of in emergency management, but I'm angry about the structure in which FEMA has to operate. Whether there's going to be a FEMA tomorrow or not, who knows? But the bottom line is that, quite frankly, the agency has been boxed into a terrible system that we keep strapping new shiny parts to. I always equate it to being we look like one of those cross-country bicycles going down the road into a headwind at 5 miles an hour, and we keep strapping new shiny parts to that bike, but yet the frame is cracking and it's rusty and it needs to be replaced. And I'm one of the biggest believers that we have to set FEMA up in a situation that's based on, first, the disaster victim, and then two, how can the agency actually be successful? Because it's become a dumping ground over decades. It's become a dumping ground for complex problems, and so there is a formula, and I've always tried to put things into to help people visualize what's going to work and what's not. And so I've always said that, to me, successful formula of disaster preparedness, response, and recovery for this country looks like that chair that you're sitting in, and imagine that chair is your community, that's your state, that's your city, that's our nation, and it's supported by 4 legs. Well, what do those 4 legs represent? Well, the first leg represents a culture of preparedness within our citizenry that does not exist. Our public awareness campaigns are laughable. They're not working. If they have been working over the last two decades, then why did the disaster impacts seem to be getting worse? We can come back and talk about that, but I think we've got to go back and get back to the civil defense days of instilling tangible skills rather than just telling people to go buy supplies for 5 days, right? We have to understand why we're registering people into individual assistance before we start to develop, awareness campaigns telling them what we want them to do, right? The second leg, and I'll go back to this first leg, with the culture of preparedness. I mean, you can graduate the most prestigious universities in this country and still not know how to do CPR or invest $1 in the stock market. That's a big problem. And, you know, and we often say that neighbor helping neighbor is the most important part, but what actually, I mean, ask yourself, what tangible skills do you actually bring to the table to your neighbor if it all goes down? Do you know how to produce food? Do you know how to produce clean water? Do you know how to do CPR, first aid, these types of things? What actually do you bring to the table? Ask yourself that question. You know, a majority of people don't, you know, would rather just call 911 and have somebody else come in and do it, you know, rather than being prepared and being able to do it. But yet you can graduate high school and college and Harvard and everything else and still not know or have to be able to do it. The second leg is strong state and local government, which I'm a big believer. I've always said all disasters are locally executed, state managed, and federally supported. It is not, you know, after Katrina, Congress attempted to reform FEMA and turn it into the nation's 911, and it's never recovered from that. When FEMA is the nation's 911 and the situation's bad, the disaster's never going to go well, and I'll come back to that. But I believe that, you know, honestly, governors need to step up to the plate and really outfit their state-level emergency management, you know, look at their budgets. With all the rhetoric and the talk that's taking place now and in the leadership positions that you're in, I'd be going to my county council and I'd be going to the state legislature saying we better get ready to be, you know, a more robust agency or have more robust capability as the federal government wants to become more of a block granting agency coming down the pipe. And I believe that, you know, you need a strong state and local capability that the federal government supports and supplements when your capacity has been exceeded, not take the place of your capacity and gets out of the, you know, everybody move out of the way, the federal government's here. The third leg is the private sector. You know, in emergency management, there's this misnomer that we are the incident commanders. We're not the incident commander over much, actually. We're more of a coordinator than we are an incident commander. And what I mean by that is that when you think of the things that have to be working in your community, who owns that? It's the private sector. 85% of the things that work in your community is the private sector. It's not government. And, you know, but yet our response plans are all dictated on how we're going to mobilize our emergency support functions and our government assets to mobilize for this incident. And these are our tactics. But yet, oh, and by the way, I've got a private sector liaison in my, you know, my EOC. Well, whoop-de-doo, good for you. That person has no authority to make decisions on the power grid or the telecommunications backbones or whatever else. They may not even know who's in charge of these things. Who owns, you know, the infrastructure in your community, and how have you roped them into your response tactics and your mitigation plans going forward, right? 85%. The nonprofit organizations exist in this third leg too, so they're the glue. The nonprofits and the NGOs should be refocused on how do you get them focused on the problems that government can't solve at any level because of big bulky policies, rules, laws, whatever. Get the NGOs focused on the things that government can't do, the people that fall through the cracks, right? The fourth leg is the firepower of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, marshaling federal resources down through a governor, ultimately to that local level, to help those in need, right? When you remove one of those legs, the chair becomes less stable. You might still be able to sit in it without one leg, you know, if you kind of prop some of the other legs up. You remove two, you're getting into real trouble. And when FEMA makes the news and it all goes bad, guess what? There's three legs of that chair missing. And FEMA's the only leg going in. And that's what happened to me in Maria in Puerto Rico. That's what happened to the nation when Katrina hit Louisiana. That's what happened in North Carolina in some cases. And so, you know, when you think about this model, if that's the case, why do we keep strapping new parts to this rusty bicycle? Why did Congress last session have 12 bills to reform FEMA? Do they not even know that there's 12 bills out there? And then two, how do you get them to do one meaningful bill? One that gets FEMA back into a disaster relief mode to where it can be successful.
So I want to touch on that for a second here. You know, FEMA's got a lane, but there's a lot of departments in federal government.
Amen.
That do a lot of different things. And it sure seems like, in time of disaster, that all missions of the federal government seem to belong to FEMA. And I'm curious, will that continue to be the case?
Yeah, so that's got to stop too. So we have to recalibrate the swim lanes. And if I offend anybody, I'll go buy you a beer down in the Trident room after this. But you know what? Other federal government agents got to step up and do their damn jobs. And, you know, when I'm the Federal Emergency Management Agency administrator and I'm in Puerto Rico and it's my job to rebuild a power grid, where the heck was the Department of Energy? Where was the response mechanism of the Department of Energy? You know, when FEMA's got to get involved in the migrant support sheltering, where the heck are the pre-event contracts in CBP and DHS to do that job? Why do you have to go use FEMA mechanisms? When we go through and see 67 hospitals collapse in Puerto Rico, why is FEMA the one stabilizing those hospitals? Where the heck is aspirin, public health, and HHS? So I get to say that because I was the one doing their jobs. But yet, when the power's off for a year, whose fault is it? It's FEMA's fault. I didn't let the power grids rot and decay over a 2-decade period. Whose job was that to regulate that infrastructure? Why do we let drinking systems in Michigan or Jackson, Mississippi rot and decay to the point where, oh, well, FEMA's not going to declare it? I don't think FEMA should declare it if it's deferred maintenance. But where's the regulatory aspects of making sure that when infrastructure is rotting and decaying, it doesn't become more of a disaster than necessary because somebody has got their eye on the ball and watching and doing their part to make sure that this is going to be a problem. Nobody ever briefed me that the power system in Puerto Rico was rotting and decaying to where Hurricane Maria really shouldn't have been that bad. It really shouldn't have. But that's why it was. Because if you fix the power, you fix things across everywhere else. And I think, again, I'll buy you a beer. I'm sorry if I offended you. But we've got to get these other agencies to start stepping up. I'm not sure that we learned a whole lot after COVID. What are the domestic capabilities of this nation not to be dependent on China and Malaysia for the next pandemic event? What, are we just going to redo the strategic national stockpile that was never meant for a pandemic? It was meant for biological and chemical attacks on cities and counties. What about, where's the digital blueprints for the private sector when we need to build ventilators? Why doesn't somebody in this school right here or in this group go invent the digital warehouse of how you produce PPE and the stuff anything that goes in a hospital? Where are the blueprints and the information for the private sector to go develop it? How come we're not having these conversations after going through these things? And largely it's because we're stuck in this response mode. We're just constantly responding, and we're not learning and making meaningful adjustments. And Congress is piecemealing things like FEMA by saying, we need this bill, we need that bill, we need to do this, we need to do that. Rather than everybody stepping back and saying, okay, let's go back and recalibrate every agency and what they're responsible for.
So Brock, just so we can take, just for a moment, the crosshairs off of FEMA, because there's, and we'll come back to that topic here in a moment. With Hagerty, you get the opportunity to work with a lot of municipalities, local agencies. It's not just FEMA and the federal government. And you talk about how we're so busy, constantly doing all these different things. At the local level and municipal emergency managers, we're getting assigned things like homelessness or, long-term climate change issues, these slow-moving issues. How do you, it seems to me there's some resonance there on the role of emergency management at the local level.
It's translating down all through. The complex problem that's too hard for any government agency is being dumped on the lap of the emergency management, industry, in my opinion. And so, to me, homelessness is not an emergency management problem. That's a public health problem, and it becomes a law enforcement problem. Congratulations, you've inherited that too. And, but the problem with emergency management is that we do not have a strong lobby. There is no real lobby in emergency management that has the ability to push back and say enough's enough, we're not doing this anymore, or we're going to strike and protest, or, whatever, or we're going to shape the laws in Congress. The problem with what happens in emergency management is that when something bad happens, like Katrina, we developed the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. We build this massive capability at the federal level, and then the capability at the local and state level lags so far behind what FEMA's got in its arsenal. But we're never going to fail in the first 120 hours of response ever again. Here's the system. And then Sandy hits, and we have the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act because FEMA screwed up again. We didn't handle the Rockaways and all the flooding really well. And there's massive problems. And then for the first time ever, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, I was able to successfully advocate to Congress. I can't lobby Congress, but we did get some things done, like the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grants, and we increased the most important piece of that was increasing management cost provisions. Because when you look at when I was in office, the 2 years I was in office, if you add up all the recovery dollars, they're going to go to fix the communities in 17 and 18 to 19. All the California wildfires, it was 220 events. There was a new disaster or wildfire every 3 days. And all the money added up and obligated, that's going to be obligated, was more than the 9 previous FEMA administrators before me combined. I didn't have the staff to send. And in some cases, most of the function that FEMA does is a grants pass-through process anyway. It's not necessarily like we need all these bodies on the ground. You need the bodies on the ground. You need to be able to dictate how your recovery goes, and it shouldn't be guided by FEMA. I don't know your community in Santa Clara like you do, right? And so what we were trying to do with the management cost provisions was to allow state and local governments a provision to hire your own force account labor or go hire consulting firms to come in and arm yourself with the capability to handle big disasters, because I was telling you, I don't have anybody to send. I don't have any more to send. And quite frankly, I'm not so sure FEMA should be sending thousands of people downrange for every disaster. We don't have it, and it doesn't make sense. And when you look at the disaster declaration process, which is totally broken.
By the way, I told you all this is going to be spicy. Lots of hot takes here. This is one I was excited to get to. I'm glad you're jumping to it.
Well, we'll go back. Let's go back and look at like the funding that the federal government spends on the disaster declaration process. And man, we were just getting hammered. I mean, of course, the nation goes 11 or 12 years without a major landfall and hurricane until I get into office, right? 2 months later, it's like the last major hurricane to make landfall, Cat 3 or greater, was Hurricane Wilma in 2005, right after Katrina, and then the faucet turned off, And of course, I go in, and I've always said every time I change jobs, something catastrophic happens. But the bottom line is that when we started to analyze all the disaster declarations, when you look back at 50% of the disasters that FEMA declared historically were less than $7.5 million. All right, hold on a minute. $7.5 million. 50% of the disasters FEMA declares is less than $7.5 million. You mean to tell me that these states don't have $7.5 million bucks to spend on a disaster, a small flood, an isolated tornado, whatever? 50% of the disasters. If I had drawn a threshold and said FEMA is not going to declare anything that's greater than $10 million, I probably would have cut out 50% of the disasters, and all the researchers would have gone, wait a minute, what happened? What mitigation happened to reduce the number of disaster declarations or whatever? But it's actually a really poor business model. And so, when a disaster is declared, let's walk you through this. This is your nation's disaster declaration process. And it was created on April 1st, 1979, right? So when a disaster occurs, what's the first thing you do?
Well, I'm going to determine whether or not I meet the threshold for...
No, before all that.
Oh, well...
What about the people?
Activate the EOC.
Yeah, you're focused on life, safety, response, stabilization.
Right.
What's the next thing an emergency manager does once all the life safety is sustained, lives are being sustained and life safety mission starts? What's the next thing that the emergency manager is charged with going out and looking for?
Cost estimates on losses to public facilities.
You're right. So they go out and do damage assessments, and they're not looking at like, oh man, that's pretty tore up, that's bad, whatever. What they're looking for is uninsured public infrastructure losses. Hold on a minute. Uninsured public infrastructure losses. If you have a mortgage on your house, have to have insurance on that mortgage, right? On that house, right? You have to have insurance, to protect you. It is that's the first line of business. But your cities and counties can be self-insured, which means we don't carry insurance because we know FEMA will fix it. So what happened back when all this system was created was they attached $1 to every citizen's head in the United States, $1. So they would say that if the state of North Carolina had 10 million people in it, and the state of North Carolina had, flood or tornado or whatever went through, and they go through and they can find 10 million people times $1 is $10 million. If they can find more than $10 million of uninsured public infrastructure, you will get a presidential disaster declaration in this country. What does that dollar even mean? It doesn't even mean anything. It means absolutely nothing, but that's how your system works. And then that dollar did not grow with CPI and inflation and index for 2 decades. I mean, it literally, when I was in office, grew to $1.54 per person. So whatever $1.54 is times the population of your state, whatever that number could be, 15, 20, 30 million, in some states it's less than $2 million. For FEMA to render a disaster under $7.5 million, half the disasters that FEMA renders, the cost, the overhead cost for FEMA to render that disaster is more than the grant funding we're actually handing out to a state to fix that problem.
Brock, I want to touch on something right there. There's an accusation being made here, and I think it's really important that we clear this up. It seems that since the 70s, really the exit of the civil defense era and the progression since that time, the case you're making is that locals and state officials have offloaded the costs of their risk exposure to the federal government as opposed to owning
The question
insurance.
should be, why are you not allowed to insure it if it's insurable? If it's not insurable, then let FEMA come in and help you rebuild that. But if it's insurable, here's the problem. If we want to talk about climate change or whatever the future threats, there is no incentive in the current disaster declaration process for any community to do the right thing or what's prudent to build a resilient community or state. What do I mean by that? You are not rewarded for doing proper land use planning, ensuring your infrastructure, or passing the latest round of building codes that the ICC puts out. If you do none of that, you're more likely to get a disaster declaration and be rewarded for doing absolutely nothing. Let me put this another way. You're Santa Clara County, County Emergency Management Director. You are out of your bottle of water. The county has used this bottle of water. The next thing you do is you go to county mutual aid and you're like, hey, neighboring county, can I have a bottle of water? Nope, I'm sorry, we've used ours too. We're kind of dealing with the same thing. Well, if county mutual aid fails,
Regional.
then you start to go regional.
State.
And then if you go to the state and you're like, hey, we're all out of bottles of water. Hey, Governor, we need some bottles of water. And the state goes, well, man, I've already handed out the bottles of water. I don't have any left. Let me go to the President of the United States and ask FEMA. FEMA's sitting on 15 billion or 30 billion or 40 billion bottles of water. But guess what? You can't have one because you didn't meet an uninsured public facility loss threshold, which leads to the disaster equity debate of why small communities can't get disasters. And literally, if you live in like Georgia, for example, if Atlanta doesn't get hit and lose major infrastructure that's uninsured, small town Georgia will never get a disaster declaration, even though they've had $10 or $15 million worth of damage because of the way that this whole system is set up. So we say all that to say, and then with the emerging threats, cybersecurity or attacks on Colonial Pipeline, the stuff you can't even make up anymore, right? Well, these disasters and the threats are changing, but the Stafford Act has not, and the disaster declaration has not. So how do we start to recognize extreme heat or cyber attacks on Colonial Pipeline, which we were probably 24, 48 hours away from gas not showing up at gas stations or food not showing up at grocery stores, but yet all the rhetoric is, don't pay the ransom. Screw that. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars of loss, and real problems in our logistics. Well, the disaster declaration system doesn't even handle a disaster like that. So how do we wipe it out and get rid of the entire concept? How do we just get rid of it?
Let me just underline that. The proposal is to get rid of the disaster declaration and proclamation process altogether.
I think it's a ceremonial term to make sure that the president has their eyes on a bad disaster in your community. That's it. And if you want, I mean, that's really the ceremonial piece, in my opinion, of the disaster declaration process. What if we did away with it and went to a complete and total cost model share system? If you really need the help, regardless of what you face, some new emerging threat that we didn't guess in our threat hazard identification risk assessments, and it really causes you economic harm or loss of life or, some capacity that you can't overcome, why would the federal government not give you those bottles of water if you really needed them because you didn't meet some arbitrary threshold? So what if we just went to a cost share model system where FEMA could actually render the assistance? They could send you teams, technical assistance, or grant funding, and then there's a cost share. If you don't do any land use planning, pass your building codes, and insure your infrastructure, the cost share is 50-50. If you do some of it, maybe the cost share is 75-25. If you do most of it, maybe it's 90-10. And in some extreme cases, maybe it's 100%. But we've got to build incentives. We can't keep talking about the skies falling with climate change or whatever it may be and not build in incentives to do the right thing. Throwing more mitigation funding at problems is not working either. You know, there's been, you know, these whole studies of $1 mitigation equals $13 of recovery. Show me where that really happens, because the dollars are climbing exponentially in the recovery realm. And the dollars have been climbing in the mitigation realm as well with BRIC.
So Brock, you're proposing a pretty radical change in the way business has been done. And you're certainly, as you mentioned, not the only one calling for radical change in FEMA. Now I'm curious, with all the seemingly inevitable change that's coming to FEMA, well, I'll start by asking this question. There's 20,000 plus FEMA employees. Mm-hmm. How big should FEMA be?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. But again, I feel like the pyramid of capability is upside down and it should be switched the other way. I would rather put out grants, again, on the MPG side to fund capability at the local and state level than to amass this massive federal government capability. There is always going to be a need for FEMA. And you can't just do away with FEMA, by the way. There is a lot to FEMA that's more than what you see handing out, you know, disaster assistance in the first 120 hours. I mean, they literally are in charge of continuity of government for the entire executive branch. They are the largest global insurer in the country. You can't just throw out the NFIP and leave millions of people uninsured. FEMA is incredibly important. There will always be the right element. I don't know what the right size is, you know, when it comes to FEMA, but I welcome a reforming of the agency and almost a rebranding. And, you know, because I'm tired of FEMA getting kicked in the teeth. There are 20-some thousand golden-hearted people, you know, that work in there. 95% of them, 90% of the people that go into that agency bust their rear ends. They're public servants. They get blamed for stuff that's just so far out of their control or not even right. Like when you hear, oh, FEMA's kicking people out of hotels in North Carolina. You know who they're kicking out? They're kicking out the homeless folks that didn't have a home before the storm. Oh, they're kicking, you know, there's people living down by the tent, you know, in a tent by the river. Yeah, they are. You know what? They've also been offered a hotel room or a manufactured housing unit in a group site. You know, take the story to the next level, right? And then FEMA gets beat up, you know, for those types of things. And then again, they're blamed for things that are outside their swim lane. So if I could do it, if I could wave my wand, FEMA would be a politically neutral agency that wouldn't even have to adhere to a disaster declaration process. That it would be mostly and most of what it does is a PA, public assistance grant writing function in the recovery arena. But here's the other problem. So I had to ask Congress 3 times in 2 years for more money into the disaster relief fund. I had to ask them to cancel $16 billion in debt for the NFIP program. Thank you, taxpayers. But 3 times. Congress gave money. They granted those requests every time. They gave money to 30 different federal government agencies to fund 91 different recovery programs in this country. Good Lord, if you're good at AI, will you please take this problem and consolidate it into 2 grants that would be most effective? You know, why is FEMA doing housing? Why isn't HUD doing housing? You know why FEMA's doing housing? Because HUD failed at it and it was given to FEMA back in the day. Let's give it back to HUD and make them operational again. Again, let's recalibrate that swim lane. Get FEMA focused on the disaster relief and initial kickstart to recovery. We are not an all things to all people agency either, and nor should we be. I don't know how to restore LA County's tax base as an emergency manager. Nobody has ever told me. They're going to have an eroding tax base. It's going to happen. And yet, you know, all of the grant funding, and a majority of it, is passed through FEMA to do long-term community recovery. We're not economists. I don't know how to get your businesses back up to the table. That's not our job. Whose job should that be? You know, and so I really believe that FEMA should be a neutral agency that is focused on the disaster relief and initial recovery, not this long-term community recovery that we've been put forward. And it's okay to disagree with me, by the way. Again, I'll buy you a beer, I promise.
I'll tell you what, there's something I really appreciate about what you just said. And as a local emergency manager at the municipal level, I've had a hell of a time trying to describe the differences of emergency management's function in an acute, chronic, or systemic issue. And oftentimes, people that want to deal with systemic issues look to our office and say, I don't know, you guys can deal with this, right? And I really appreciate the definitional assistance you've provided here on on the more appropriate roles and functions. But that does bring me to something which I think is really important, and it's a bit of a legacy that you left, which is the lifeline concept within FEMA. I'm curious if you could talk about the disaster that precipitated that, what it means now, and how it continues to evolve.
Yeah, so Harvey, Irma, Maria, California wildfires, you know, all at the same time. There was a day I spoke to 8 different governors from, was it Tinian and Saipan all the way to the U.S. Virgin Islands. Tinian and Saipan got hit with Hurricane U2, but you never heard about it because they're 14 hours ahead of us, or actually they're 17 hours ahead of us right now. So it doesn't fit nicely into Fox and CNN News prime time. But I mean, they got hit harder by the strongest hurricane that ever hit any United States territory in history, and you wouldn't even hear about it. But the problem is going in as FEMA administrator every morning is that I would go into my 8:30 briefing, and the stack of paper on what's going on across the country would get to be this thick. I mean, it got to be in a report. And the problem is that every state and the way that we roll up information from you, the local, to the state, to the federal government is in emergency support function format. Yeah, ESF format. You know, it's not NIMS compliant. So the ESF format, right? Some of these states have like 18 ESFs. And then here's California, here's Puerto Rico, here's the U.S. Virgin Islands, here's Texas, here's Florida, here's Georgia, here's, whatever. And you're sitting there going, how am I supposed to correctly marshal assets from the federal government, not an infinite amount of resources, a set amount of resources? Who's most important? What's the biggest problem we can solve with our resources? How am I ever supposed to filter through that? You can't do it, right? The other thing is that we spend way too much time trying to risk analysis everything. We're trying to figure out everything that can kill us or break us or bust us up. What we don't think about is what's got to be working in your community that if it's not working, people are dying or life routine is disrupted. That's easy to guess. And it doesn't change very often. It's grocery stores, it's banks, it's your power system, it's the can you hear me now, telecommunication systems. But yet we sit there and ask people to go through risk and vulnerability assessments and mitigation. I'm not saying risk and vulnerability assessments are bad. I think we put way too much emphasis on it rather than who actually owns the infrastructure that's got to be working again, that if it's not working, people are dying or life routine is disrupted. What is that for your community, your school, your police department? I don't know. But you need to create your own understanding of what that is, who owns it, and they're the ones that need to be in your EOC and ready to go, informing you of how the government can use their resources to help you come back online, whether it's a foreign state actor, cyber threat, or a tornado or an asteroid. I don't know. And so we started asking those questions, and it got really frustrating in Puerto Rico. So imagine there's this island called Puerto Rico that gets hit, right? Everything's wiped out. Infrastructure's just gone. And there's only one port that's open. So we'll do a little exercise with you guys, and you guys can get involved. If you only have one runway, and the United States Marine Corps, thank God they go in and get the runway open, and they're like, hey, we can talk one cargo plane in every 30 minutes. What do you put on that plane? Let's hear it. Water. Why?
It's the first thing you need.
Because CNN's telling you water. Water. Okay, water. But water, but the question is why. Okay, what's next? Come on. Medicine. Why? Who's telling you that? Where are you getting that intel from? Something to open another port. Army Corps of Engineers or the Marine Corps again. That's good. Increase the bandwidth, the pipeline. And I'm not being hard on the answers. But here's the thing. I made a cardinal mistake in emergency management. It was a failure in communications once again. Damn. We didn't know how to communicate after 9/11. We didn't know how to communicate after Katrina. I did it again. Shame on me. Shame on me. We didn't know how to communicate in Puerto Rico. We didn't need food and water. There was a 30-day food supply on that island at any given time that was never written into any catastrophic FEMA plan, by the way. See, all of our plans are what can the federal government throw at the disaster, not what can we utilize in the community first and marshal that out. There wasn't people starving. There was plenty of water. There was plenty of food. There was a 30-day food supply. The problem was we could not communicate to people where to go get it. But we got $2 billion worth of commodities to Puerto Rico. Congratulations, thank you, taxpayers. And, we got sideways on that. And then it just, I sat back and it was like, man, I'm an idiot. I made a huge mistake again. We should have been putting AT&T and Motorola and whoever else on those planes going in first so that we could communicate. But we were going through our checklist like we normally do, and we never question those checklists. And all of that started to get us to hold back up. After all of this stuff, it's like, I can't tell what's most important. We're not responding and utilizing our resources correctly. Where are we getting situational awareness? All of these things. And we stepped back and started asking that question. I want to know what's got to be working, and if it's not working, people are dying or life routine is disrupted. I want to reformulate the plans that where the state's identified to me what's red, yellow, and green. Red means it's busted up. We don't have the capacity to fix it. We need your help. Yellow means it's going to be coming back online. We got it under control. Green means it's good. So then I could go through 8 state reports and look for the red circles and go, all right, what are we doing about that? All right, what are we doing about that? What are we doing about that? Let's marshal this or do that, and it could really get us to fine tune where we were going. The next thing about it is then again, what is that? What's got to be working? First of all, you got to have safety and security. If you don't have safety and security in your school, your church, this place, then you don't have a viable community or environment to begin with. I don't care what all the arguments are about policing and everything else. If you don't have safety and security, you can't respond or recover. So good luck with that. That's the first tenet. You got to have that. The next one is really comms, communications. You got to be able to have communications as well. We never lost safety and security in Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands or any of these places like what happened in New Orleans. We never lost that. We reorganized around comms, making sure that we had the ability to talk, right? The next thing is food, water, and housing. So food, water is not water, bottles of water. It's bulk water systems. It's water systems that we need working. Who owns all the bottles of water in Monterey right now? I bet it's a company that services grocery stores. Why do you not have an MOU set up with them if you're the local emergency manager here to say, man, I ain't gonna be waiting on FEMA for that water. I'm gonna do it myself. I'm gonna sign an MOU with them and I'm gonna get FEMA to reimburse it if we ever need it during an earthquake. I'm gonna buy it at market rate, right? So you're utilizing the resources there. But food systems, like if we get attacked by Russia and the Ukraine or Russia and China, whatever, they're gonna attack the food safety systems and we're not having those conversations. We're too worried about whether or not we should keep TikTok on or not. But we're not talking about threats to the food safety, communication, and then also the energy side. You fix the energy, you solve problems across the other infrastructure. So here's one of the things that was happening. We go through our checklist and we're shoving debris out of the way after every disaster, wildfire, tornado, or whatever. Well, guess what? You're shoving that debris out of the roadway system in front of the infrastructure that the private telecommunications systems and energy systems can't get to their stuff to fix anymore because you've shoved all the debris in front of their stuff. They need to be dictating where you need to move debris out so they can get access to the energy, to the fuel systems, to their systems to get back up and running so that it eases your job as the emergency manager.
On that topic, Brock, I'm so glad you're saying this. I think there's a hubris amongst emergency managers that we can do the job that private sector businesses who are every day refining their profit margins, looking for better ways to do that job, whether it's getting food to people, getting the company that owns those water bottles has got every plan they can to make sure they can get water bottles to people because that means a profit. That right. Comes down to the profit. And the idea that we think we're going to be able to distribute food or water better than those private companies,
can't do it.
It's silly. And I think you're really touching on something which has been a theme throughout this conference, which is that whole of community resilience, that connection between the private sector, the NGOs, the community, and government, and military to some degree when we talk about civil defense.
Yeah. Bigger FEMA is not the answer. And I'll go back onto something else too. Like, all of this infrastructure is interdependent and most of it's privately owned. How many of you, raise your hands, have ever heard of a grid security emergency disaster declaration?
Say it again?
How many of you have ever heard of a grid security emergency disaster declaration that the president can declare?
Not seeing a lot of hands.
There's an entire disaster declaration around the energy grid called an energy grid security emergency disaster declaration. How come we don't know about this? How come we're not having discussions at Apex about this? Where's the Department of Energy and what are they doing about it? Do you realize that the president can declare a disaster for the energy grid if it's attacked? It's a form of terrorism, has nothing to do with fuel. Fuel was left out. It's only just generational electricity power, which makes no sense. But anyway, they have the ability to adjudicate who gets what when it all goes down. Western Interconnect, when you lose California, Nevada, Mexico, parts of Mexico and Canada, the whole West Coast goes out. Then somebody in the Department of Energy gets to dictate who gets the transformers or the capability. It's going to go to DOD first at the expense of your public health systems. Why are we not having these conversations around infrastructure? We've got to rethink these plans. And then here's the other thing. The BRIC concept, what was important about the building resilient infrastructure and communities concept is that, again, I feel like our nation's mitigation strategy has been piecemealed. It's been 50 state plans that they put in wonderful things in there. We're going to do this and this and this. Here's our strategy in Wyoming, Lynn, and then here's our strategy in California or North Carolina. Well, none of it's a patchwork that's not being funneled together. What are we striving for as a nation with all this mitigation money and all these plans? What problems are we solving? To me, your mitigation effort should be focused on how you stop the negative constant response cycle we're in. I love green space, but that ain't going to solve the problem. What's going to solve the problem is how do we start to work with public and private sector, have real conversations on how do we use this mitigation funding. The BRIC funding was the intent was if these are the community lifelines and we need these to be working, we better be figuring out nationwide strategies to mitigate those things. What if next year we the BRIC grant was solely put forward to energy and fuel? What if the next year was our hospital systems? What if the next year was our transportation systems? Then we could start to measure the benefit of mitigation and start to go back and tell the story to Congress. But right now, we can't do that. And, quite frankly, the emergency management, again, our profession is not organized. There's thousands of people that left FEMA that have nowhere to go. There's no alumni network. There's no lobbying capability whatsoever. So the laws keep getting reshaped for us and on our behalf rather than including us to be able to do it right. And so, I really think that we've got to step up, have a stronger voice, push back on things. When things are added to our swim lane that aren't properly ours, we got to start pushing back, saying no. It's not my job.
Couldn't agree more. I've got one more question before I want you to talk about your passion project, but before we get there, I got one more question, and we'll let some folks ask some questions, and we'll not stand in the way of them getting out of here and on their way to the Trident.
I probably owe like 400 beers out there, don't I?
There you go.
Yeah.
Like I said, I knew this would be an interesting conversation. And I hope you guys are getting out of this what I was hoping you'd get out of this when we chatted this morning and some of the things that raised my eyebrows and made me think. And I've been thinking about it all day before I got to sit down here with Brock and chat with him in front of you all. There's been a thread in this whole conversation, and it's gone throughout this last 3 days. And you've talked about how FEMA needs to, be reformed in some ways. You and I talked about even potentially a different name for FEMA. We've talked about, the public awareness and the narratives and conversations that are being had in the public and amongst our peers about these things. And, the public awareness campaigns are not doing what they should be doing. We're not getting the ROIC on those dollars. And I'm curious, how do you tie resilience across all this in a new campaign that addresses things down to the level of what we saw during the civil defense era of a whole of community approach?
All right, I'm going to answer this by asking a question. How many people starved to death in North Carolina after Hurricane Helene? How many people starved to death after Katrina? How many people starved to death in Puerto Rico? Why are we asking everybody to go buy supplies for 5 days, food for 5 days? If they don't have it, it's not a realistic financial ask. Now, let me ask this question another way. How many thousands of people were uninsured or underinsured after the LA County wildfires and Hurricane Helene in North Carolina? 30%. I mean, thousands upon thousands. So what's our public awareness campaign? Why are we telling people to go buy supplies for 5 days? If they even have that money, why don't we tell them to go be properly insured? And yes, I understand that the insurance companies may pull out of some areas. And I don't believe that insurance is a right. If you want to live in some of these areas that are incredibly vulnerable, that's up to you. I hope you can afford it. But the bottom line is that nobody's having a conversation with the insurance companies either on how do we use all that $1.2 trillion of infrastructure improvement funding to buy down risk in communities to get the insurance companies back to the table. The insurance companies are being scapegoated just as much as FEMA. But why should I insure your community if you're not going to do the land use planning and the building codes and everything else? There's got to be a balance, right? But our public awareness campaigns, again, are not working. How do we get them to do, how do we start to think about low to no cost tangible skills we can instill within American households that actually prevent them from being registered into the individual assistance system? And I'll give you another example. In Hurricane Irma in 2014, the forgotten Cat 4 storm that occurred between Maria and Harvey and everything else, we registered more people in Florida for individual assistance than we did in the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Texas, and California combined in 2017. But yet Florida's supposed to be the gold star prepared state, right? Hurricane state. You know what was happening? Everybody was selling a home in California, New York, New Jersey, moving to Florida, getting suckered by a realtor, buying the homes that nobody else knew to buy, like anything built before 2001. If you own a home in Florida built before 2001, you probably ought to dump it, because it was the building codes changed in 2002. Anything built after 2001 survives, but a realtor's not going to tell you that. They're going to sell you that house. So everybody moves out of the Northeast and California, escaping whatever they're escaping, and they go down into Florida and they buy a house for cash, and guess what? Somebody tells them, well, you don't need insurance because you don't have a mortgage. Then the hurricane comes, wipes their house out, and then they lose all their wealth, and guess what? They want FEMA to fix them and make them whole. That's what's going on in your country. And yet, we want to blame FEMA. The problem is much greater and more complex than FEMA. But it's got to be down to simple things like, you know what? Any house can flood. Forget the FEMA flood map. Throw it out, do away with it. I don't care about a FEMA flood map anymore. I know that people have to use that for certain things. But to the citizen, any house can flood. Any house can burn. Any house can be knocked down by whatever it may be. Go get insured. But yet the insurance companies will talk you out of buying flood insurance or earthquake insurance because you're not in a flood zone. But what they don't realize is the Walmart that was built down the street changes the flood map. The newly built environment can change the flood map 30% every year. Or maybe Santa Clara does a really pathetic job of cleaning out their storm drainage ditches. Who knows what's in the storm drainage ditches around Palisades in Los Angeles County? Think about it. So simple tweaks to the public awareness campaigns. Any house can flood. You should get it. It's a lot.
All right, so total segue. I asked you a little bit about, selfishly, how come emergency managers aren't being headhunted by Fortune 500 companies? And the skills we have seem to me to be reflective of chief operations officers in the fact that we're constantly aware of all the KPIs of all of the departments in our organization and the stressors on those KPIs. And we came around to this conversation about private sector passions and what emergency managers can do. And you told me a little bit about Hickory FC and what you're doing is your personal passionate project. And I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about that.
So one of the things that I've reflected after leaving FEMA is, you run an agency of 20-some thousand people, multi-billion-dollar budgets. You're working with every 20-some odd government agencies in the National Response Framework. You feel like you led the nation through the worst series of disasters ever. But when you leave these positions because of the political nature of emergency management, and it's not just the FEMA administrator, it's some of you in your positions now at the local level or state level, is that you're either loved or hated based on who's president or who's governor or what the political affiliation is. And therefore, I feel like, a lot of times emergency managers are passed up when it comes to the Fortune 500, CEOs. We're looking for the next CEO. Like, why the heck can't I run Delta? Why can't I do these things? When you look at the pressure and the collaboration and the team building and the relationships and I've worked with every governor in the United States at one point. I mean, it's, so you know these people and different things, but unfortunately, we got to get the politics out of disasters. I hate the politics around it. I don't think the FEMA administrator should be presidentially appointed. I think it should be more of a DOJ like neutral type agency where, you know, that position changes every 8 years, every 6 years or whatever, because FEMA is actually a victim of who's president and what, you know. But the one thing that I would tell you is that when I went into office, I never wore my politics on my sleeve. I'll give you a little piece of advice. If you want to wear your politics on your sleeve when you go into office, the bureaucrats in your office are going to smile at you, nod, and wait you out. And that's the same with FEMA. And actually, I used a Naval Postgraduate School concept to build a strategic plan called Appreciative Inquiry, and it was the ugliest book. I don't know who wrote it. It was like brown and yellow. It was like the manual that was given to my mom when I was born in the 70s. It was the same, you know, that brown and orange, you know, cover. It was the ugliest book ever. But, you know, it was like, listen, when you take over an organization, ask 3 questions. Where are you? Where do you need to be? How do you get there? And it broke down those 3 questions. And I used that to build a strategic plan and reshape the FEMA into a manner that my staff could understand, you know, how to articulate to the public what we do. So when you hear things today, what's the mission of FEMA, we got it all down on we got the plan down on 1 page, and I can still recite it. You know, we got the mission of FEMA to be helping people before, during, and after disasters. Our vision is a resilient and prepared nation. Goal 1 is to build a culture of preparedness within our citizenry. Goal 2 is to ready the nation for catastrophic disasters. Goal 3 is to reduce the complexity of FEMA. And everybody could say that. I said that before Congress 10 times in 2 years. I would always tell, you know, very quickly articulate, there was nothing political about that plan. You could put it back in right now, and a majority of people in the country would jump in and try to go in and adopt it. And that's where we got to get the politics out of it. Exiting service, again, 50% of the companies look at you like you got a third eyeball in your head because of who the president was that you served under, and then the other 50 like love you and, you know, want to, you know, put you in their will. You know, it's it's a love or hate. You know, you walk into a room like this, I don't know. I mean, you know, I don't know what the stereotypes are of somebody that served the Trump administration or the Biden administration, you know, whatever. I mean, it's, you know, we've got to pull back from that. Right now, if they clearly wore their politics on a sleeve, fair game, you know, fair game. But but since leaving, I actually partially retired on February 1 this month. It feels great. So I'm half time, 20 hours. So it's up to you guys to go figure out the next FEMA. I'm just giving ideas today for free, and then 2 guys came to me, speaking of the World Cup, I was listening really heavily to GB. So 2 guys came to me and said, hey, we're thinking about buying a site license to buy a minor league soccer team. You want in? And I said, yeah, absolutely. So I didn't ever even play soccer. I don't even know the rules of soccer, but I own a minor league soccer team in North Carolina now. And so it's been fun, man. But you know what I've learned about stepping out and doing that is that we can do different things. You know, we can go start businesses. And
you do look a little like Ryan Reynolds.
Yeah, no. Yeah. But the funny thing is that, you know, starting the soccer team is for the first time in my life, I'm actually part of an experience that people pay me to be a part of. I've never had that in emergency management. Everybody hated my guts for 25 years, you know, so it's been fun. You know, it's been awesome. We had 3,500 people show up to our last 2 matches in a town of 50,000 people. So soccer's coming by storm, you know, so I'm excited about the World Cup. So if you're in North Carolina, May 3rd is our first home match. Come on.
Cool. I'd like to take you up on that. Well, I want to make sure we open the floor up to some questions, but I would just like to say, you know, we had a gentleman in our class, a good friend of mine who's not here today. His name is Jonathan Gaddy, and he once said in our group chat, and our cohort talks every single day and have for 10 or 11 years now, he said, you know, the average person doesn't know the difference between a federal freeway, a state highway, or a city street. Yeah. And they generally don't know the difference between a FEMA person, a state emergency response person, a county emergency manager, a city emergency manager, or your local first responders. And
it's just FEMA.
That's it.
That's the problem.
That's it. Yeah. And I want to thank you for your service and for the innovation that you've brought to FEMA and continue to bring through conversations like this. And it's been an absolute pleasure having this conversation with you. It's been a real privilege for me.
So if you could wave your wand and change one thing about emergency management, what would it be?
Oh, good
I'll
Lord.
ask the first question.
Good Lord. Oh, man. If I could change one thing about emergency management, I think there's an authority issue. And like you said, people aren't, we don't have advocacy at the legislative level. We don't have I firmly believe, and I've been having these conversations lately, that the function of emergency management, if it lied in a position of authority like a municipal chief operations officer who could coordinate and ensure that the directives are met for missing KPIs, where every single day, so I believe that the gross motor skill of how we run government on a day-to-day basis, with Robert's Rules of Order and building council packets for every week or two when we see the council, is not the same as when suddenly we're put into crisis. The weapon you're going to grab every day, you suddenly have to do something different for how we manage government. And for me, the gross motor skill should be the thing that you're most used to using, and what you do every day should be what you do in time of crisis, just at a higher tempo. And suddenly we're overlaying a whole new mechanism for how we manage government when crisis hits that we're not using on a day-to-day basis and our members in government are not familiar with. And what I'd like to see is the process of emergency management and the function of emergency management put into the executive function of managing municipalities, organizations, and I think there's a disconnect there between what we see as formerly law enforcement and firefighters coming in helping the process of public safety coordinate to now the whole of organization on a day-to-day process being more efficient, more effective, and ready to address any stressors that come at it.
And that's a good point. The tools in the emergency manager's toolbox are never consistent. You never go into the same disaster understanding what disaster funding is going to be available or not. And the only way you get access to all 91 programs is if CNN and Fox News pick up your disaster and blast everybody, out of their way and blame people for the disaster. And then Congress goes, oh my gosh, we need to turn on all these programs. Here you go. Heather, I think we're done. I just want to say thank you again. Don't mistake my passion for, don't be angry, whatever.
Thank you.